Welcome. Today we're talking about neuroplasticity, the third part of the three parts in neuroplasticity. This is the anxiety crusher, and I'm applying the 7-step reset to crushing anxiety, stopping the spiral before it begins. There are so many similarities because both are involving the neuroplasticity, or I should say the network of neurons in our system, and both can be seen as transforming from habits that were to habits that we desire. So the idea here is, behind all of this, is to put the automaticity to work for us. Everyone has experienced the automaticity of habits and how quickly they can come in. At the extreme, we've seen the videos of the different characters or videos. I think everyone knows the kind of name that's been applied to this certain kind of person. You could see the triggered behavior happening real time. Another one, a more serious one, dire one, you can see when you're looking at videos of law enforcement interacting with the community, and sometimes those law enforcement people are triggered. You can see them, and it's a fight or flight. They are literally in the fight or flight, and the signals that are coming from the other person are interpreted as threats when the other person is not doing anything. On the other hand, you can see a person saying, I'm not resisting, I'm not resisting. You can see how these two things kind of scale up, because they're saying they're not resisting, but you could see the tension, you could see the stiffness in their body. It's in their mind, they're not resisting. It's just that the fight or flight is taken over, and their body is doing everything to survive. And so it's all tense, even though they think and they're intending not to resist. The body's taken over. For the law enforcement individual, you can see that they're feeling this tension, and it's a threat because it could instantly turn into an altercation. And so they're scaling up. And the both of them together, if you could stop it and just get into their conscious mind, you would see what was going on with both of them. And so a big part of dealing with this anxiety and with what's coming, and I talk about VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, which leads to the BANI, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible experience that people are having. And the two together, the external coming in, the VUCA, and then the internal experience, you can see how these are just right for this constantly aggravated experience that people have, which just creates more and more tension, more and more anxiety. And so the reason why I call it the anxiety crusher, this is not mental health at all. I'm not dealing with mental health. What I am dealing with is the habit patterns that we live with all the time, but there's a threshold, and when they cross a threshold, it's triggered behavior. And you can look at triggered behavior very similar to the way you would look at a phobia. Now, with the phobia, the person learned somewhere, again, it's not mental health. I'm talking about this from a leadership standpoint and interacting in an organization standpoint. But the person may have learned early on that panicking saves them. You could think of this as a simple phobia of being in the water. Maybe they were dunked in, and while some people say that that's the way to teach a kid to swim, if they're breathing in when you dunk them in, that can feel like drowning. Now this kid grows up with a phobia of water, and what they remember is they panicked. And when they panicked, they were rescued. The nervous system doesn't know any better. It's just associations. It's not a mind. It's just associations. This happens, I get this. Do this, get that. And so panicking becomes the solution. So this phobia of water, the thing you see displaying, the panic, the tension, the intensity, the inability to hear from other people who are around them, who are trying to help them, but they now see as contributors to this threat. That panic is a learned behavior. Consciously, they know that panicking is not what rescues them, but the conscious is on a back seat because the network of neurons processes so fast. This is energy pulsing through the neurons, 100 billion neurons, each connected to 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons. So we have this massive interconnectedness, trillions of connections. that processes at 11 million bits per second. Meanwhile, the conscious mind processes at 50 bits per second. So you have the conscious mind is not even close to being able to engage because the network of neurons is scaling up and more neurons are coming online, and because neurons that fire together wire together. That's why I talk about them coming online. So the more and more neurons that come online, you can see how what could have been a mild misunderstanding, switching back to business and organizations, turns into this massive conflict that people can't be brought back off the edge. They're just at each other's throats. You can see how relationships break down over this process of habits interacting with someone else's habits and both perceived as threats, and it just scales up so quickly. Again, just look at one of the videos that show how a person is completely irrational and they're coming up with irrational solutions. They end up calling the police. It's just learned behavior. They don't really understand it. Then they end up losing their job. They get canceled and on and on and on. And they're so apologetic. But then other people kick other people's habits, and that clicks in and said, "Oh, they're not genuine in their apology." Well, yeah, it's the difference between the conscious mind and the subconscious. But what happens, and subconscious, I call the network of neurons. Remember, the conscious mind is 5%. 95% of what we do is done by habit. So the habits actually show the personality, which is why the public, the onlooking public, doesn't agree that or believe that the apology is genuine because they see the personality. They go look at their profiles and they see that this person has acted that way before. It doesn't mean that consciously they mean something different. It's just that their habit patterns are so strong and they don't have a handle on them, and because the neurons that wire together fire together, if a person experiences this anxiety more than a little bit, it's happening more and more and more and more and more, eventually that becomes their new personality. So all that to say, I use the 7-step reset as a transformation model, and I designed it to move from comfort zone to above the line, to hit that inflection point and keep tracking on a northern trajectory. But because you're crossing a barrier in transformation, you're crossing a barrier that has seemed impossible before, that has stories around it, beliefs, habits. It's very similar to coming from below the comfort zone and getting back into it. And I would say if we're feeling too much anxiety, then that's below the comfort zone and we want to get back in. You still have to move up. While the barrier is not the same kind of a barrier, you still have to move from where you were to where you want to be. And that involves commanding the network of neurons. There's so much written about this, but everything I've found, all the literature I have found, it doesn't look at it from the network of neurons. It looks at it from the subconscious mind, and it treats the mind as the brain at work, which is incorrect. The mind is the mind, and the brain is running the network of neurons. We have to remember that the mind is dominant over this network of neurons, but it ends up being hijacked because the network of neurons processes at 11 million bits per second, whereas the conscious mind only processes at 50 bits per second. So that's the conundrum that we're dealing with, but it doesn't have to be something that you struggle with when you look at it as the network of neurons is exactly that. It's the network of neurons. It's not a mind. You are the mind. So if I'm talking to somebody in a coaching situation and I'm asking them to give me their narrative of what they think is going to happen and how they see themselves fitting in and what they want, this kind of conversation takes them into a conscious mind conversation. I get beyond the network of neurons. I'm asking them, why is that important? And tell me about this, and why is that important? They're totally in the conscious mind. So I calibrate that. I calibrate, what do they really want? They, them, the conscious mind, the present moment person, the mindful person. What do they want? What do they really want in life? What's their vision? And I calibrate that and lock that in. The majority of the time we're interacting, it's coming from the network of neurons, right? I mean, that makes sense. 95% of everything we do is done by habit. So what I do is I'm listening for where there's conflict between the network of neurons response versus what they want. This is the leaving first base to get to second base in the baseball metaphor. And this is why it's so hard for some people to replace habits. I don't think breaking a habit is a useful strategy. I advocate replacing the habit because of the way synaptogenesis works in neuroplasticity. The new habit literally allows the old habit to fade into the background because, as I've talked about in the last 2 days, the synapses is removed or pruned from those dormant neural pathways. So this is why we talk about letting go. This is why transformation is difficult. This is why you go through this cognitive dissonance period in transformation. What I'm talking about here, we talked about this the last couple of days, and I'll just bring that back up as a quick reminder. So this is the comfort zone in here, and these are the caution zones. As you're in this comfort zone going up and down, and then you're getting into these caution zones, that might be where you start feeling a little bit anxious and you make some changes and you get back on track. But when a person gets out of this, normally I was talking about it in transformation, but if you think about it like a person starts to fall out of this and they get down here, this danger zone, this caution zone is spelling that danger's coming. So now you can imagine this person who's getting triggered. Once they fall down here, they're into fight or flight. And that fight or flight doesn't recognize that this is not a major threat. It's just a little situation, but they're treating it as a Serengeti tiger because that's the way the system is designed. And that Serengeti tiger threat is down here and has them down here. It takes work to get back up here. And it's not a rational conversation. They've got to be able to command their network of neurons. So part of it is prevention so that that doesn't happen. But the other part of it, and that's where step 2 comes in my 7-step process, which we'll get to. Step 2 comes in at being able to get back here quickly. So we're training ourselves to be on this upward trajectory, and that looks like this. We're training ourselves to be on this upward trajectory, but at the same time, we have to train ourselves to be able to get back to this very quickly because it's very easy to fall down. You can fall down from here back into a horizontal comfort zone, and you can fall out of your comfort zone into fight or flight. And you'll hear this talked about as the sympathetic nervous system is kicked in and then the parasympathetic nervous system comes in to bring us back. But what I want to do is focus on how the car is driven, because when we get into the different parts of the nervous system and the different parts of the brain, it gets confusing. And now you have multiple things you have to keep in mind and try to figure it out. And it's something that's kind of very abstract. But the reality is that we have 100 billion neurons, and those 100 billion neurons tend to behave the same way. They're interconnected. Now there's different groups of neurons, right? You have mirror neurons, and you have the amygdala neurons, and you have the basal ganglia neurons, and they have different purposes. But at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're getting in the car and driving. We don't need to know the interaction and the changes that happen when you change the intake manifold and you don't change the exhaust manifold. We don't need to understand all that. That's in our system. We just need to know how to get in the car and drive. In the transformation work, when I look at major transformations, what we have is 7 performance series: mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional, and on the left side, and I say that the left side is in our control. Clearly, the mental, physical, spiritual is in our control, and that spiritual is not the true spiritual realm. It's our higher self. And I look at it as the higher self is above the conscious mind, and the conscious mind is above the network of neurons, and the network of neurons is not a mind. So the you is what's important. And this is going through some transition because for centuries we've called it a subconscious mind. We've only had the brain scanning tools available to see what's really going on with the network of neurons and myelin and synapsis, synaptogenesis, a neurotransmitter, mirror neurons, etc. Mirror neurons were just discovered and developed in the research in the 1980s. So when you're thinking about a 10,000-year-old human, right, from the hunter-gatherer time, 9,500 of those years was all hunter-gatherer. We didn't start seeing automobiles until a century and a half ago or 2 centuries ago. You could go back and find quote-unquote cars 3 centuries ago, but it wasn't a mode of transportation until much more recently. The same thing with some of the tools and weapons that can fire long distances. All of this is new relative to the brain. And in fact, you can see that the brain in many studies is shown to be 200 to 300,000 years old. When you look at it like that, you recognize how much in its infancy neuroscience is, and that's why it's still evolving. And then when you look at how scientists do their work, it's about getting peer reviewed. So they're tending not to go wider. To get peer reviewed, they're going deeper because other scientists have to be able to replicate those same research outcomes. And if they start going too wide, this is a layman talking about this, I'm not a scientist, but if they start going too broad as opposed to deep, then it becomes more and more difficult to get peer reviewed because those experiments become harder to do. And that's what's driving this. This is why, in my opinion, we've gotten so far down this rabbit hole of focusing on the parts of the brain trying to explain emotional intelligence, when the reality is emotion is energy in motion, and if you allow it to process, it moves on because it's energy in motion. If you stop it by trying to suppress it, it then becomes a neurobiological event and it's lodged in the network of neurons. Now, the network of neurons, there's 100 billion of them connected to anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons, but they behave similarly. You put more myelin and more synapses in there, and they're going to be stronger. You take the synapses out, that neural pathway goes dormant. If you have a neural pathway that does not have myelination, it's not going to be as strong as the one that is myelinated. So when you look at it like that, okay, so now you have a model and a framework for how to change habits, how to establish habits. You want to use deep practice to create myelination, and you want to use progression to keep the neurotransmitter moving into the neural pathways and away from, and moving the person away from homeostasis. We're moving towards allostasis. Now that was a mouthful, but it's this much compared to talking about the basal ganglia and the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex and trying to have a person understand all of that while figuring out that the sympathetic nervous system kicked in and the parasympathetic. Then you've got, how do you do that? How do you make the parasympathetic nervous system come online earlier rather than later? You do it with habit. You do it with step 3. You do it with, in my 7-step process. So steps 1 and 2, what I'm talking about now is 1, neuroplasticity. We covered beliefs. I'm doing 3 parts of neuroplasticity because it is so important and far-reaching. Then we'll do priming and mindset, and physiology is another one I'll probably do multiple segments on because it is far-reaching. Step 2 is the check-in. Step 2 is where we basically look at it like a dashboard and understand, hey, do we need to get back? Do we need to get back to, this powerful present moment, this consciousness, and then having tools to get back to consciousness. But what I was just describing with the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, and whether or not the reticular activating system is involved, et cetera, and when the prefrontal cortex is coming in, this is happening at million bits per second speed. How does the conscious mind, how do you as a person influence that or change that? You don't, but you can condition it in. You can change the conditioning. All this conditioning happened. So you have a macro system. The macro system is designed so that the majority of conditioning happens from age 0 to 7, and then it's tweaked and adjusted through our teens. That's where we get our personality and our style, etc. And then it's locked in from 19 to 27 with the prefrontal cortex, which I like to say that locks in the model of the world. And then from 27 on, obviously the ages can generalize and be a little different, but from 27 on, we start falling into this path of living by habit because we recognize can't change anymore. That's coming off of 27 years of all you had to do was show up and you got better, right? In the up until 19, we had the neurotransmitter and the myelination helping us build those habits. And then from 19 to 27, the prefrontal cortex was forming, which is 20 billion neurons. So there was plenty of neurotransmitter available for those 20 billion neurons for that prefrontal cortex to form. So what we had to do was show up. You show up, you absorb it, you don't have to work for it, you got better. Show up, absorb it, you get better. Then in our 30s, it's like you work so hard and you don't see the improvement. Willpower, which was much more accessible in our 20s because willpower benefits from having neurotransmitter production, And now you don't have that excess neurotransmitter production. And it's like willpower doesn't work anymore. The discipline doesn't work anymore. They still work. They just don't work as well as they did in the 20s and the teens. So all of this comes back to what I'm talking about with neuroplasticity and why step 3 is so important, because we condition it in the same way that who we are was conditioned in at hours 0 to 7. We can reset the conditioning to be aligned with our quest, our life design, our purpose. And this is what I talk about when I say put the automaticity to work for us. It's not to say that the automaticity is directly working against you. It's working for a different place in time. As a boomer, when I was 0 to 7, my world was completely different than what it is now. Computers, cell phones, we didn't even have pagers and beepers when I was 0 to 7. And global, right? We were living in a bubble of the local news. And it was really interesting in the early 1980s when fax machines started evolving, and you could see how news was going on around the world. And I think it was that caused the Gen X parents to helicopter the millennials, because we went from seeing one kidnapping every other year in our local news to seeing a kidnapping every week, to the point where they don't even count them anymore. It's not that they weren't happening in these other places, but you take all these localities and you can see how that has shifted. So my 0 to 7 is very different from the 0 to 7 of a person today, not to mention the computers and the social media and on and on and on. And that is why the 7-step process is 7 steps, even though this whole thing is only a second. But I have to go through the 7 steps to put it together. So we're in command of the pre-stimulus. The stimulus reaction happens, and we want to be able to condition it so it's doing our work, our bidding. And then we have the pause. And then the step 4 is the sequence where the conscious mind comes online. This is conscious mind and the network of neurons working together. Then the stimulus happens. The network of neurons jump into gear. Quarter of a second, they're off and running with the reaction. Quarter of a second later, the conscious mind is coming online. But if it's a triggering event, the subconscious has already taken over and the conscious mind is just along for the ride, and we're cooked. So in this model, because you condition in the pause for the conscious mind to come online and understand what's going on, and then there's a conditioned check-in. Do we need to emotionally modulate before our action? This can be a 0 to 90 second step right here. And if it's not needed, and what you'll find when you do this well and you have the right conditioning here, you won't need the emotional. And this is why I will be talking about this with emotional intelligence, because a lot of emotional intelligence, in my opinion, that work has to do with the corrective side after it's already engaged. They do deal with the pre-side, but by looking at it this way and stopping it at this step right here, instead of trying to control this step, we recondition this step. And then you don't have the dysregulation over here, and our actions are more aligned with what we wanted rather than what we don't want. And then we have to get back to mindfulness so we're ready for that next sequence, because this is happening 33,000 times a day. We have to get back to that present moment. Then we go through pre-stimulus, conditioned reaction, response, get back to that present moment consciousness, that mindfulness. And this is where the dysregulation comes in, because if I have a bad thing happen to me at the early part of the day and you don't have this process in place, you can see how you're very easily then looped into having a worse and worse and worse day. And the 7-step process stops that. And that's why I decided to start talking about this related to anxiety and stopping the spiral before it starts, because you're stopping it early on. Later, as we get through this, I will start moving into how this applies to leading others, because there's a big part of this. In leading others, you not only have to regulate yourself through here, the leaders who get high performance, the multipliers as opposed to the diminishers, are good at reading where people are. Because if I understand where they are and I'm attuned to that, and they are already on the verge of one of these fight or flight moments, I will choose to not bring up the thing that I know would probably push them over the edge. I recognize the value of waiting until another time. I also understand that if they're over here and they're in an emotional dysregulation state, it doesn't make sense for me to keep talking about my agenda because it's there's just irrationality here, and it's more valuable to let them get regulated. And even teaching regulation, but you can't do it in the moment. You have to be the bigger person and move on. And sometimes that dysregulation can last for hours. We've all experienced whatever it is. I mean, for me as a teen, it was seeing the police car lights light up in my rearview mirror. You know, my heart would jump and my adrenaline would flow. And we're going to look at the following parts on this. And yesterday I was talking about allostasis and homeostasis and how we have a role in moving the synaptogenesis process to go towards those neural pathways that we want. So the short version is that you have neurons, they're connected with synapses, neurotransmitter, and when they go dormant, the neurotransmitter comes out and it's no longer a neural pathway, but the neurons are still there. And then when you engage in activity that communicates to the central nervous system that this is important and we need to engage, the neurotransmitter is pruned from dormant neural pathways and put into the activating neural pathway. And I talked about this using like seasonal sports where people at the first day or two they may feel very awkward, but then it comes on. Then they activate the other neural pathways, and the skiing or the snowboarding or the basketball, whatever that seasonal sport is, they're back to normal within a day or two, or at least feeling like they did at the end of the prior season. I use the example of a thru hiker where in the beginning, and these are the people who are hiking like from Mexico to Canada or the other way around or whatever. These are 90-day hikes covering 2,000 and 3,000 miles, right? You get the picture. And at the beginning of these through hikes, they may be walking like 10 and 15-mile days, but by the end of the through hike, 30-mile days are like a common thing. And a 30-mile day, that's like doing more than a marathon. That is the equivalent of doing more than a marathon day in and day out for sometimes weeks at a time, running above 30 miles per day for multiple weeks at a time. And if you've ever run a marathon, you know the amount of recovery that's needed after that, but yet they're getting up the next day and doing it again. So this is an example of how allostasis comes into play. What I didn't want to lose with that example is that you don't have to do a through hike to have this happen. You could simply hike different routes and increasing the amounts of the difficulty. You can go from hiking paths to hiking something with some elevation, to hiking something with uneven surface where you're having to use balance, to hiking something with some steep terrain, to hiking something where you have to scramble and you're using your hands. And if you don't have that available to you, what you can do is alternate between speed and distance. So you can do maybe a longer distance hike, and then you can do a shorter hike with some speed to it, and alternating. Because what we're doing is we're telling the brain and the nervous system that this is important. We need more neurotransmitter. The thing we're fighting against is homeostasis, which is the brain wanting to stabilize and use and produce less neurotransmitter. By producing less neurotransmitter, it conserves energy, which is what we do. Allostasis, by throwing something new at it every day, we're constantly putting neurotransmitter in, and neurotransmitter has many, many benefits. Well, I would say that the same activities that drive neurotransmitter have many other benefits as well, so they go hand in hand. But again, we're looking at driving the car, so we don't have to understand all of the inner workings. But the short version is that if you look at sprinting is one of the best examples of producing neurotransmitter. When I'm talking about sprinting, short runs, all out, going for time, pushing yourself. And this kind of activity requires a whole week of recovery because it's so intense, but it's full body. And if you've done any sprinting, you know how easy it is to get hurt. Your whole body's involved, and you got to build up all these different sets and et cetera, et cetera. And it hits all 7 factors that I talked about. Novelty, and you could add more novelty by working on the first third of the sprint, the middle third, or the last third. You can add novelty by sprinting uphill. You could add novelty by reducing the recovery time or increasing the recovery time, etc. Intention. So I have an intention, obviously, to run fast, and you have precision. You may not feel like it, but that is a precision activity, because if you don't have the precision, you're going to get hurt most likely. You have the balance / complexity, because the parts are working together, and to really sprint fast, you're even using your legs in a way that's not intuitive. That's why you look at some of these really fast sprinters, it looks like their feet are moving in a pure circle. And then you have the explosiveness, the intensity bursts, and then you have progression. So we're trying to get faster, or maybe going uphill. That's another way of doing the progression, and struggle at the edge of ability. So sprinting to me is always struggling at the edge of ability if you're going by the clock. And sprinting hits all those factors. And when you hit those factors, you're increasing neurotransmitter production, which means more dopamine, more serotonin, and more acetylcholine, which is the muscle junction, the neural pathway to muscle, and glutamate, which is the central nervous system signal to the neural pathway. This is all neurotransmitters. So as you're producing that, you're making that system better, stronger, faster. Well, it also improves your mitochondria, the organs within the cells, so to speak. You're improving brain-derived neurotropic factors, so you're making the neurons stronger. So think, you're in the 20s, your neurons were strong. You had a lot of synapses. You had a lot of myelination. The threshold was low for those things to happen. Well, brain-derived neurotropic factor, you're improving the neurons. AMPK, which is the metabolism. You're improving anti-inflammation. So this basically is anti-aging. Sprinting would be a very good anti-aging thing. The fact that it requires a week for recovery makes it a little bit inaccessible. But the good news is something like hiking, even if you don't hike, but you're hiking every other day or 3 days a week, you can still apply those same 7 factors in your hiking. You can even take a flat hike and do it by going off trail if it's possible where you are. If you don't have to stay on trail, you go off trail and go over some logs and stepping around things like that, or finding some a little bit more difficult terrain to hike on along that quote unquote easy path. But adding hills and time and all these things make a difference for those 7 factors. What I didn't talk much about, and by the way, you can also apply that with painting. That's what I said the other day. You can apply it to painting. You can watch that video. It's the second one in the neuroplasticity. What I wanted to get into is that it makes it easier to have a bigger goal. So you can imagine sprinting just to be sprinting. You're out there sprinting. Why am I sprinting? It's going to get old very quickly. It's a very difficult activity. Demanding, emotionally demanding, because it takes your energy. But if you have a goal, I'm sprinting to get better at skiing, or I'm sprinting to support my anti-aging, or I'm sprinting to help heal whatever, right? If you have a bigger goal, this is why we start with goal and purpose. If I'm doing transformation work with somebody, I don't even engage until we have something that's bigger than them. I'm looking at a 10x of what would be a normal goal for them. I want to 10x that. Maybe it's only 3 or 4x, but it's got to be something that's bigger than they are. And then it makes it easier. Having meaning makes it easier. So it's almost like, yes, we need the novelty and intention within the 7 factors, but you also need the larger context of why this is important. That's why I start with the goal. And then yesterday, I started talking about when you set your plans you want to start with the outcome. Now, this is probably off the beaten path when talking about anxiety, but it comes together because we are changing our neuroplasticity. And in order to change your neuroplasticity, you go through this process. So this is the outcome. We start with the outcome. You don't start with what should I do next. And too often if a person is feeling that anxiety, they're saying, what am I supposed to do? I don't know what to do. And they land on what they should do next. And what they should do next is probably 3rd, 4th, 5th down the list of the ideal thing that they should do. They come up with something, and typically that thing that they come up to do is what they've done before, which means they just recreate that same cycle. This is why we go to the Merlin method and we go with what's the outcome? What do I want to achieve? What do I want to have happen? What's my narrative look like of the end state? And then for that end state to happen, what has to happen before that? And this is, I put 4 on here. This is 15, it could be 30, it could be 50 boxes. But the idea is what has to happen before that? And you put the list of things that have to happen before that. And then what's the list that has to happen before that? You make that list. And now you have a better view of what your first step should be. And a lot of times that first step is not what you would have done if you just simply say, what am I supposed to do next? Or you ask your friends, what should I do? Because they're typically going to come up with what you've done or what they've done the last time in the same situation, which just creates more and more of the same. So that's a big part of starting with the goal. And this is the micro view, right? What's your outcome? But again, it starts with the bigger goal. Now, the other thing I talked about is when you get out of your comfort zone, which is where we exist. And today we're out of our comfort zone. Without even breaking above this zone or this one, we are already out of our comfort zone. Now, in transformation work, when a person is on this upward trajectory, we talk about using principles. You don't have the habits. You don't have the habits for your network of neurons to lean on to know what to do. So it's more exhausting. The 95% of everything we do being done by habit, it makes it easier for us to get through the day because we're doing it by habit. We don't have to think about it. But when you're above here, it's more trial and error. And trial and error can be exhausting because there's a lot of failure, and we're conditioned to see failure as failure. And it's not failure, it's just another way that it doesn't work. This trial and error works is so important. But what you do is you follow principles, or what I like to call near principles. And those near principles from where there's deep research. I like books like 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Multipliers, Good to Great by Jim Collins, Great by Choice by Jim Collins. I think Primal Leadership is another good one that uses a lot of deep research that helps you set your near principles. And by setting those near principles, you have your range of what you should be doing and what you should not be doing. Right, so the last thing that I did not do, and I think we have to do, I've talked about the neuroplasticity at the macro level, but now what do we do? How do we change the neuroplasticity at the micro level? Obviously, if you're in that stimulus reaction cycle in the moment, you don't have time to do deep practice, and you're not going to go in and do some hiking to get more neurotransmitter in. So what we have is a 250 millisecond or quarter of a second zone where, so we have the stimulus that comes in, then there's a quarter of a second reaction time. So this is the first zone, right? And meanwhile, your senses are taking in this information, but they haven't handed it off to the network of neurons from where there's deep research. I like books like 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Multipliers, Good to Great by Jim Collins, Great by Choice by Jim Collins. I think Primal Leadership is another good one that uses a lot of deep research that helps you set your near principles. And by setting those near principles, you have your range of what you should be doing and what you should not be doing. Right, so the last thing that I did not do, and I think we have to do, I've talked about the neuroplasticity at the macro level, but now what do we do? How do we change the neuroplasticity at the micro level? Obviously, if you're in that stimulus reaction cycle in the moment, you don't have time to do deep practice, and you're not going to go in and do some hiking to get more neurotransmitter in. So what we have is a 250 millisecond processing time. There's 3 phases. There's the initial phase, and in that initial phase, that's where the decision is made by the network of neurons. It's not really a decision, but that's why the outcome is set that, oh, this is a threat, this is dangerous. The second part is, what are we supposed to do with this? How do we handle this? And the third part is what we alert the conscious mind to do, what the network of neurons alerts the conscious mind to do. And then here we have another 250 milliseconds for the conscious mind. So what we do here is, rather than focus on what it is that happens, I'm going to focus on what we do. The first thing we're going to do is a positivity exercise. What this positivity exercise is, it shifts the bias of the network of neurons from seeing everything as a threat, or seeing 80% of the things as a threat, to seeing stuff that comes in as neutral. The way we do that is by teaching, by associating. It's all associations, right? This is not knowledge. To know and not do is not know. You have to condition this in. And it takes about 6 weeks to condition in this step using the positivity exercise. But the positivity exercise gets the subconscious, or the network of neurons, to first look at, does this thing have anything to do with my goals? Does it exist because of my goals? So the example I use, we're going to condition the network of neurons over a 6-week period with just different examples every single day, to teach it how to look for the bigger positive context. The example I like to use for the bigger positive context view is, you get a flat tire, your first reaction is, oh man, this is bad. But then, before that reaction comes in, the subconscious looks to see what has to exist in order for this flat tire to exist. Oh, a car. We have to have a car. The car was once a goal, therefore flat tire is not a threat, because the flat tire is a result of the car, which was a goal, and I like my car. That's how we train the network of neurons to not see everything as a threat. Now, it'll still see the threats as threats because there's no greater positive context. But same thing as a job. You have something happen at work and it makes you annoyed. Before you even get annoyed, the network of neurons says, what has to exist for this thing to be happening? Oh, I have to have a job. I like my job. Therefore, this is not a threat. And the network of neurons goes on looking for other things. And this is how you get to the point where you just ignore stuff. It's not that you're ignoring it consciously. It just doesn't even come into play because the network of neurons excluded it. The next thing that happens is associations to what has worked before. This is where, again, I'm not talking about this as a neuroscientist. I want to explain it in a way that can make sense for people. The associations is what worked before. This is why I like to talk about being triggered, because when a person is being triggered, they're using what worked before. That was the example I used with swimming. The person who panics in the water. Panic worked before, so they're going to panic again. This association thing is not thinking. It's very much like ChatGPT does when you ask it, when you put in a prompt, or AI when you put in a prompt. It's going to give you what's associated with it. That's why the artificial intelligence doesn't do a good job of relating the unrelated, or recognizing when you're getting to the margins of diminishing returns. Whereas a human, we can see, oh yeah, that only works up until this point. Now you have to move to that point. But this association thing, and so what we do here is, there's a lot of different ways. We can do reframing, content reframing, context reframing, swish patterns. I'll use ums as an example. A person says and they want to get rid of the ums. You can tell them all day long to stop saying They can say, I don't want to say but 10 years later they're still saying What can they do? They can imagine themselves, this is a swish pattern, and the reason why it's called a swish pattern is because you make a sound whoosh, and the reason for the sound whoosh is because you're adding in another sense. But you're making a picture of what you want. I'll just simplify it, say getting a standing ovation, but it could be being effective with your children. It could be being effective at work. It could be having a better interview experience. You make this picture of what you want, and I would spend some time on that picture. And that picture is what we call dissociated. So in other words, you're looking from your current eyes into this picture over there. It works either way, but having a dissociated picture here works better. Then what we're going to do, we're going to look at what happens before we say Watch a recording of yourself, or just pay attention. If you've sat in a class with a professor who says a lot, you can predict. It becomes like a game, right? You can predict when they're going to say the next time, and you're going to be right 70% of the time. So there is a thing that happens before you say I like to say that it probably was learned early on in life, where you looked up at the ceiling and the teacher said, the answer's not on the ceiling. What's the answer? And you've learned to say to let the teacher know you're thinking. That's just my way of connecting the dots on it. Who knows how it started, but public speaking is one of the top fears, so it may have something to do with that. And what we're going to do then is bring up that thing that happens. It's maybe we're thinking about something. Maybe we've lost our words. We're trying to find that, what is the thing I want to say? And in that half second, we say because it feels like an eternity, and it's not. You will learn. You can do this by reading and then pausing intentionally, and then reading and pausing intentionally. We're going to learn to pause. But the swish pattern is you imagine yourself pausing to be able to say to find the words. And as soon as you imagine yourself pausing, you blow that picture up and you put a picture of yourself getting the standing ovation or doing a good job in the interview or whatever it is. And you do that 5 times in a row, and you make a sound, you know, whoosh, something like that. And that sound brings in the other sense. And then you do it again, you repeat. You do it again the next day. And what you'll find, the first thing that happens is you become aware of when you're saying It doesn't cure the You still have to have the agency to say, I'm going to pause, instead of saying and that's why we teach you to pause. So you can intentionally pause. I can speak while I'm talking to you and then stop talking like that, like I just did. I just did it again. And these are short pauses. These are half a second to 3/4 of a second pauses, maybe a second, but it's nothing. It's nothing. And you teach yourself to pause. And so now when you do the swish pattern, you're focused on what I want, the outcome, and you've already taught yourself to replace it with the pause. That's what we do in this stage. And then the third stage is the handoff. So again, this is not neuroscience, it's neuroscience aligned. This is my 7-step reset. This is what I do in the step 3 of the 7-step reset. And this handoff, the same way that when you ask a question of your subconscious, it always has an answer, right? The same way if you ask a question of artificial intelligence, it always has an answer, even if the answer is not right. So what we're doing is we are going to train our network of neurons that in the process of handing off to the conscious mind, we're going to organize this into the first step of problem solving. Clearly identify the problem. By doing this, we're putting the network of neurons to work. Remember, this whole phase is 11 million bits per second. Over here is 50. So we are leveraging this in this gap. We're leveraging this gap to take what's been given us from the stimulus and then the perceived reaction based on associations to turn it into something that's useful for the conscious mind, which is why I call it the first step of problem solving, which is clearly define the problem. And over time, we're learning to include our principles in their principles. That's what's going on here. That's what we're doing in this process of the positivity. This is training. This takes about 6 weeks. This is you just learn to do the skill, and there's many ways of updating your associations. It's literally what is just associating something new with that same behavior, allowing the neurons to build up and the old neurons to lose the synapses, the pruning process, and then building myelin on the ones that are really important using deep practice. And then the handoff. The handoff is nothing more than putting a demand on the network of neurons. The same way that when you set a goal, you'll start having serendipity. You'll start seeing things that help you towards your goal. It's just that you're communicating to the reticular activating system that this thing is important, and then it starts looking for it because it has to process and get from the 11 million bits per second down to something that your conscious mind 50 bits per second can handle. We're going to do that by training the reticular activating system. This is the biggest step here because by taking 80% of the threat associations out of the mix, we're already reducing the amount of anxiety we're going to experience, and we're already reducing the amount of dysregulation we're going to experience. And then by changing the associations, we're able to rewrite associations. The things that I was afraid of, like getting a question in classroom as a child that may have scared me, as a leader, I want questions. We don't want to have that negative reaction that makes people not want to ask us questions. So we have to change our associations. Again, you can do it with switch patterns. You can do it with reframing. You can do it with just the drills, deep practice drills in a safe environment. And the one thing I'll say here is all of this requires calm in a major way when you are threatened, when you're hyper focused, when you're catastrophizing. You have to get into a state of calm, and this is where I think some of the high achievers, overachievers, have trouble, because in order to have calm during your on ramp, during the learning curve, during the beginning of a new quest, you're going to make mistakes. And in making those mistakes, you have to be able to stay calm. And the way to manage that is you use little tiny targets. I remember setting really small goals of, I wanted to get to giving out 20 business cards a day, and I would set these really small goals because I didn't learn this, but I was taught by people who made decisions based on this kind of thing. And so I would use like 3 cards a day, something that you could do on a bad day of a bad week, and you build a habit. And once you build a habit, then you add 4 cards, then you add 5 cards, then you add 6 cards. Unfortunately, I didn't have the knowledge to be able to withstand the push from my manager, who was telling me, no, you should be giving out 10 cards. You should be giving out 20 cards. And it wasn't even a thing. It was my decision. It was my choice to get to 20 cards a day, because I read the book Tom Hopkins, how to, selling. And anyway, you get the idea. Baby steps. Do the baby steps. Embrace it. Understand that it's leading to something. The same way a through hiker tolerates the 5 and 10 and 15 mile days at the beginning of the hike, knowing that the stress is going to build because they'll be behind time for their permits later on in the hike, but then watching the 30-day hikes and even 35-mile days unfold. So there you go. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about how this neuroplasticity interacts with priming. Priming is a separate node on my diamond of beliefs: neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, and then physiology in the middle. But neuroplasticity and priming have a very, very strong interdependency. And we'll see you next time.